Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we follow up on the Amnesty International report on Israel. We report on the killing of a peace consultant in the Philippines and all the politics that are playing out on the sidelines of the Africa Cup of Nations. First up, we reported yesterday on the Amnesty International report documenting the policies of the Israeli state towards Palestinians and concluding that it must be held accountable for, I quote, committing the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians, end quote. Globetrotter Chief Correspondent Vijay Prashad interviewed Amnesty International Middle East and North Africa Research and Advocacy Director Philip Luther for more on what the report includes and what it doesn't.
This is actually one of the first reports that brought the three aspects of the Palestinian experience to bear. In other words, Palestinians inside what is called 1948 Israel, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Palestinians in the diaspora. This is a little bit, I think, unusual in terms of the comprehensiveness. But I think this brings us to the question, what is this system of apartheid? Can you explain that? That seems to be the core of the challenge here.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the first question we try to answer in the report. And just to break it down, a system of apartheid is an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination by one racial group over another. And that manifests itself in the laws, policies, and practices of the state that has created and maintained that system of apartheid. To be a bit more concrete and to explain what I mean by that, I mean, we looked at what we call four strategies that Israel has used and is currently using. And this is the important thing, they're being used and have been used across these territorial domains, even though the laws and the practices may differ in when you look at the detail. What we find is that there is territorial fragmentation, and that is a deliberate strategy, territorial fragmentation of Palestinians between Israel, East Jerusalem, the rest of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian refugee diaspora. And that fragmentation is key to understanding why, even though, and it's acknowledged, because some detractors say, you're ignoring the fact that Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, have the right to vote. It is true, of course it is. But the fragmentation means that Palestinians as a whole have not to date been meaningfully able to influence the laws, the policies, and the practices that not only affect their lives, but actually ensure that they are either second-class citizens or third or fourth. So that's the first thing. Then we look very carefully at the question of segregation. And what we mean by segregation is the fact that in each of those territories, but across those territories, Palestinians have different statuses. They may be citizens, but they're second-class citizens. And we describe why, because of an institutionalized regime of discrimination inside Israel. There is, in East Jerusalem, Palestinians have residency rights, but no citizenship, which and it's supposed to be permanent, but actually it's permanent in name only. In the last 40 years or so, 14,000 Palestinian refugees have had their residency rights revoked by the Israeli authorities. So, and then of course, rest of the West Bank and Gaza, it's ID cards, which means you're completely restricted. And the important thing about that is it breaks up families. You have family members in Gaza and you live in the West Bank. You have no right to see them. I mean, you meet people every day who are saying, well, I haven't seen my mother for 4 years. She's in Gaza. I'm in the West Bank. I mean, it's just that everyday experience, which it's obviously, it dominates people's lives because it's all about their home, it's about their family, and it's about a dignified life. We talk about this is a big issue, dispossession of land and property, and you see the same strategies have been used over decades to dispossess Palestinians of their land and property and allocate it in a discriminatory fashion to Jewish Israelis, either within Israel itself or indeed, of course, the illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian land in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And finally, and in a way, it complements all of that. The fourth strategy is the deprivation of economic social rights. The fact that there is a chronic discriminatory underinvestment in Palestinian communities in Israel, and the reality that Palestinians are deprived of access to their own resources, the most fertile farmland, their own oil, the coastal fishing waters of Gaza, because of a deliberate policy by the Israeli state. So that is why, to sum up, we talk about a holistic system. And while we acknowledge that there may be, of course, very different lived experiences for Palestinians, the system is one because there's one state, there's one people who are impacted by the policies of that state, the Palestinian people, and in the apartheid definition, it's about a racial group. There's one Supreme Court that is that at the end of the day is the highest court in the land, whether you're an Israeli or Palestinian, across all of those territories. And it is the intent, which we also examine in the report, to ensure a Jewish demographic hegemony across that whole area, which is where the refugees come in, because the reason that Israel, and it's open about this, I mean, it's not even a secret, the reason that Israel does not want to give the Palestinian refugees the right to return is because it disrupts the Jewish demographic hegemony. So that is why we don't think you can ignore or leave out the Palestinian refugee issue when examining the system that is in place.
A National Democratic Front of the Philippines peace consultant, Pedro Codaste, was abducted and murdered by government soldiers, the Communist Party of the Philippines announced, citing initial reports from the New People's Army. The CPP, the underground CPP, said Codaste was probably abducted and subsequently summarily executed sometime between January 19 and January 25. At least 15 people have been killed by the Philippines Army since early 2020, according to reports. Anish now joins us. Anish covers the region for People's Dispatch. What is the latest information, Anish, that we have on this particular case?
So one thing that we need to understand is that the
killing has two different narratives. One is the official narrative, where the Armed Forces of the Philippines unit, the local unit, has the East Mindanao Command, which actually conducted the supposed raid, said that there was an armed encounter between them and Codaste, along with a couple of other militants. And in that minor skirmish, Codaste was killed along with another CPP militant. Now, the thing is, the army made this announcement about days after the actual killing happened. The incident, Codaste was supposedly killed on 21st of January, and the announcement was made on January 25th. Until then, nobody had any idea where he was and what his status was. Moving ahead, a couple of days later, the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is a banned organization, are running a militant movement that has been going on since the 70s, stated that their local unit in the region where the supposed armed encounter happened have not reported any such incident. They have not, because one of the other things that we need to understand is that the army claims Codaste was found with 15 odd other militants along with him, and that's how they actually found him and had this whole encounter happening. But in that case, this is not something that will be just missed out. Even if it's happening in the forest, it will not be missed out by local reports or by even the CPP. It never really shied away from claiming any kind of encounter incidents that have happened so far. So it makes no sense for them to lie about it, if that is what and the army's version has a lot of gaps. They are not answering why it took them 4 days to actually make the announcement of the death. And there are also other factors that were not considered. One is the army claims that Kodaste had taken the command of the Mindanao Commission of the CPP and on after January 5th. They're not giving us the exact date. On why did they say January 5th is because that is when the actual the actual Mindanao command of the CPP was killed by the army in another encounter, which was also controversial. But the CPP, on the other hand, points out that he was not active in the organization or in the militancy or in the armed faction for a while at least, and he was actually detached from the NPA, the New People's Army, which is the armed wing of the CPP, since at least August 2021. So we are talking about a person that the CPP does not says is not part of any command or leadership, has been inactive, was not a militant, and he was also, according to the CPP and his other comrades, he was not communicable since January 19th. So between January 19th and January 25th, there was no news about him. There was no contact. There was no, people had no idea where he was. They knew that he was recuperating, that he was suffering from ailments. He was 72 years old. So he was actually dealing with a lot of health issues at the time. So a person of that kind, and this is something not just the CPP has pointed out, but even activist groups in Philippines have pointed out, that a person of that sort who was suffering from ailments cannot be somebody who's involved in an armed conflict at the moment, right? Or can be somebody who's fighting back. So there are gaps. And now we know the CPP has also pointed out that there is probability that Kodaste, along with the other militant who was found dead or was claimed to be dead, were probably abducted by the military and tortured. And this is not new. The Philippines Army has done that before with peace consultants, even with NPA operatives. Many of one case last year, in fact, had them abducting an NPA militant, an ex-militant, while he was on the way to a hospital for treatment because of some other health issues. So we are talking about a history of such military confrontations and military, abductions. And the Philippines military, it's not to say that there are, it shows that the military is guilty, but there are questions that are still unanswered.
Right. Thank you, Anil, bringing up history, because that's what I'm going to ask you a little bit about next. For those of us who might not have so much context on what's been happening in the Philippines over the past few decades, this is not a new conflict. So could you give us a bit of that historical context, and also tell us how these peace consultants fit into the overall political picture?
So the CPP is kind of a Maoist organization, has been there since the late 60s, and has been during the Marcos dictatorship, at least. They were one of the foremost opponents. They led an armed insurrection that actually affected nearly a quarter of the country at that time. And so the movement has been going on for a long while. It has been decades now. With the Duterte government's onset, when they came to power in 2016, there was this promise to push for a peace negotiation, peace talks, and that is when the peace consultants came in. The peace consultants are people who were either ex-militants or activists who were part of the National Democratic Front of Philippines, which is the overground kind of front of the CPP, which does activism and overground mobilizations and other sorts of things for them. And the NDFP activists, many of them remained anonymous for decades, years even. And then during the peace process, many of them had to come across as negotiators, not just in the negotiations that were happening in Norway, but also in the Philippines and also the grassroots level, because on the ground where they had to make like local, they had to ensure that peace was maintained during the process, right? And so these peace consultants were given at the time immunity that still stands, even though the Duterte government withdrew from the peace process in November 2017. The agreement, there were two joint agreements that were put out during the negotiations in Oslo, and one of them was the JSIG agreement, which ensures that all the peace consultants will be protected from any kind of judicial or legal harassment, arrest, and any kind of other attacks and targeting of them. But ever since the Duterte government unilaterally withdrew from that process, you had this constant targeting of activists, especially these peace consultants, because they have really exposed themselves, they exposed their identities. Many of them were even put in jail under different terror laws and anti-terror law, whatever. And moreover, they were targeted as militants. Many of them were not. Most of them were not involved in militancy for years before they became peace consultants. They were almost completely inactive on the militancy front or the insurgency front. They were probably members of the party. So despite having these immunity, the government really targeted them, and they continue to do that even to this day. And so you have this kind of targeting, which kind of also spills over into the civil society, where the red tagging, what is called as red tagging, which is a Filipino version of McCarthyism, where you have organizations, perfectly legal organizations, parties, trade union movements, peasant union groups, leaders being targeted as communist fronts. Even church groups, bishops, and orphanages and other kind of charity organizations run by local churches are also targeted under this. This shows a certain kind of attack on not just civil liberties, but also rights of a lot of disenfranchised people, and an attempt to do away with, or at least threaten, mobilizers and organizers who are working on the ground for people's rights and movements. So it is not just a war on the CPP, but it is also a war on the civil society at large, because it spills over quite a lot.
And I guess all of this will then flow into the upcoming elections that we will see happening in the Philippines later on. Right, so definitely a region or a nation there to keep an eye on. Thanks, Anish, for the update. And finally, we're talking about the Africa Cup of Nations. Of course, we know, and we've talked earlier about Cameroon playing host to that tournament. The tournament is at its semi-final stage. In fact, the second semi-final will be played today. Now, New Frame, a social justice publication out of South Africa, has provided some excellent coverage of the tournament to those of us who've been watching from afar, including detailed reports on the horrific stampede that organizers failed to avoid, despite spending hundreds of millions on infrastructure and organization for the AFCON. They have an editorial out that really forces you to think hard on the sport that is so conveniently whitewashed as the beautiful game. We spoke earlier to New Frame's sports editor, Njabulo Ngidi, and asked the question, is football capitalism's greatest ally?
The Nations Cup going to Cameroon was always a propaganda tool for Paul Biya. It's not just about the tournament. I mean, his support has been dwindling. The Anglophone crisis, where the minority English-speaking part of Cameroon have been protesting since 2017 because of the marginalization they suffer from the majority French government, is something that has been key in this. I mean, the people who are fighting for secession have said that they would like to use this tournament as an opportunity to amplify their voice and their point across, because the Anglophone crisis hasn't really been covered across the world. I mean, it's something that has been largely ignored. And this is something that they wanted to use the Nations Cup to sort of drive their message across. And Paul Biya wanting to use this tournament as a tool really to cement his power. I mean, the guy has been president of Cameroon since the 80s. This is arguably one of the toughest period of his time, with numerous calls calling for his head. So there's been a heavy security presence throughout the country because of those threats, especially in Limbe, which is part of the English-speaking region. So because of that heavy security presence, getting in and out of stadium has been a mission. The CAF president, Patrice Motsepe, when he held a press conference to discuss the stampede, he said that he spent 2 hours trying to get at Olembe, which is named after Paul Biya. I mean, that's telling when the guy who has a police escort who can be whisked in and out of a stadium within minutes takes 2 hours. So imagine how the normal man on the streets, how much time that they would have to spend getting in and out. So it's with that background that this is where the heavy police presence is coming from, and the whole idea of using this the Nations Cup to paint this beautiful picture of a thriving Cameroon and a president who's got everything under control. That this came, and the irony of all of this is it coming in a stadium named after him. I think, in a way, it's a reflection of where Cameroon is under Paul Biya, with the heavy military presence and the challenges that are within Cameroon that are being tried to mask through various means, including football. And it was sad to see lives being lost, especially people coming to watch a football game. But for me, the Stampede isn't just something that should be viewed in isolation, because it speaks to a bigger issue of what this tournament was aimed to do, and the challenge that is in Cameroon, and how Paul Biya is trying to fight for control and remain through all the years that he's been in charge of the country.
All right. So, Jabulu, in this context, of course, we do know that football, all sport for that matter, always has been used by authoritarian rulers, problematic states to sort of say, like we said, whitewash their crimes, to pretend they do not exist. But could you also talk about how the game maybe is also in some senses served as a space for resistance itself, and how in the context of this tournament specifically it's being seen as well?
Yeah, I think the power of sport, and football in particular, I mean, it's the most watched sport in the world. That power is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in that because of the power that it has, the eyeballs who are there. I mean, the World Cup is the most watched sporting event in the world. So because of that power, it pulls a lot of sponsors, it pulls a lot of attention. So it can be used for a number of things. We've seen in the past where the likes of Didier Drogba with Ivory Coast, where he used the Ivorians qualifying for the 2006 World Cup as an opportunity to call for unity and the warring parties to come together and not just support Ivory Coast, but also help build a strong country. We've seen with Socrates in Brazil, with Corinthians, and how football was used as a tool to sort of stand up against an authoritarian regime. I mean, we've seen so many instances, even in Egypt, with the Ultras. I mean, they've been key. Same with Algeria. Ultras were key in overthrowing both Hosni Mubarak and Abdelaziz in Algeria. So sport is that in terms of it's a political symbol. In South Africa, it was used as a place to stand up against apartheid. I mean, even before non-racialism was a thing, football was a place where black and whites can mix together and play, and that was a middle finger to the apartheid regime. But because of where things are at now, money runs sport. You see that with the Saudis buying Newcastle. And a lot of Newcastle fans are happy. They don't care about that the regime killed and dismembered a journalist. That doesn't register in their attention. I mean, what is important is that they finally have a rich man owning their club, which means that they can fight with the likes of City and the likes of Manchester United and fighting for top players and fighting for honors. So because of that power and the love that we have, I mean, a lot of people go through ups and downs with their football teams.
That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more on these stories and all the work we do, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.